For 42 years, Eleanor Vance had built her life around a simple, unshakable rhythm. It was a life measured in the turning of pages, the blooming of her window box geraniums, and the quiet satisfaction of a budget balanced to the penny. At the heart of this rhythm was a date of almost sacred importance, the 3rd of every month. She opened the banking app on her smartphone, a sleek, intimidating tool her grandson had so patiently installed for her, and stared at a number that made no sense, a figure that defied all logic and order. Zero buyers. The 3rd of the month had come and gone, but the money had not. I love you. I never ever wanted to hurt you. Eleanor listened, and every word was another turn of the knife. She believed he was scared. She believed he was genuinely sorry he'd been caught. She even believed in some twisted, broken way that he loved her. But it didn't change what he had done. He hadn't just stolen her money. He had stolen her trust, her peace, her most cherished image of him. He had taken her boundless love and weaponized it against her. The hardest part, the thing that broke a piece of her that she knew would never heal, was the call to her daughter, Sarah. She made Ben stay, made him sit there and listen as she explained, in a faltering voice, what had happened. Sarah's reaction was a second brutal betrayal. First came furious, indignant denial. "That's impossible! You're mistaken. You're confused. Ben would never do that to you." Then, when confronted with the undeniable fact that Ben had confessed and was sitting right there, her anger shifted, finding a new, more convenient target. "What did you do?" she'd shrieked through the phone, her voice shrill with rage. "Did you accuse him? Did you back him into a corner? You know how much pressure he's under at school. For God's sake, Mother, it's just money. You would turn on your own grandson for money?" Eleanor hung up the phone, her hand trembling so violently she could barely place the receiver back in its cradle. She was utterly, completely alone. Her grandson was a thief. Her daughter blamed her for discovering it. The family she had built her life around, the very center of her world, had become a source of profound, unbearable pain. Ben sat across from her, his head bowed in shame, a stranger in her kitchen. In that moment, she faced the most agonizing decision of her life. She could handle this within the family, as Sarah had demanded through her tears and rage. She could absorb the loss, accept Ben's tearful apologies, and hope he would change. It would preserve the fragile peace, maintain the illusion of a happy family. Or she could do the unthinkable. She could report him. It would mean walking into a police station and accusing her own grandson, the boy she adored, of a felony. It would shatter her family, perhaps irrevocably. But it might also be the only way to save him from himself, and the only way to reclaim a piece of her own stolen dignity. The choice was a chasm at her feet, and either path led directly to heartbreak. For 3 days, Eleanor existed in a gray, soundless limbo. The choice before her felt like a betrayal no matter which way she turned. To protect Ben would be to betray herself, to sanction his crime and enable the sickness that had taken root in him. To report him would be to betray the deep, instinctual love a grandmother has for her grandson, a bond she had believed to be the most sacred and unbreakable in her life. She spoke at length with Frank, who sat in her kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee, and acted as a stoic, patient-sounding board. He never once told her what to do. He simply laid out the grim, unvarnished realities of each path. "If you don't report it," he said, his voice gentle but firm, the voice of a man who had delivered bad news for a living, "you're sending him a message that what he did was okay, that he can get away with it. This gambling thing, it's an addiction, Eleanor. It's a cancer. And if you don't treat it, it will grow until it consumes him completely. He won't just be stealing from you. He'll destroy his whole life." He paused, letting the heavy words sink into the quiet air of the room. It was a digital ghost, a silent, bloodless theft that left no trace but a hollow, ringing echo in her carefully ordered world. Eleanor's apartment was a physical testament to her life's philosophy, everything in its proper place, a place for everything. 2 rooms, neat as a pin, smelling faintly of lemon polish, old paper, and the Earl Grey tea she brewed every morning at precisely 7 o'clock. If you do report it, It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. The family will be in an uproar. But the system, for all its terrible flaws, will force him to confront what he's done. There will be consequences. There will be court-ordered counseling. There will be restitution. It will be a chance, maybe the only chance he gets for him to get clean. His logic was a cold, inescapable cage, but her heart rebelled against it. She spent hours sifting through old photo albums, her gnarled fingers tracing the glossy image of a smiling boy on a tricycle, a lanky teenager in a cap and gown, a young man beaming beside her on the sofa. How could she be the one to put a permanent stain on that bright future? But then she would look at her empty ledger, at the stack of red-lettered unpaid bills on her counter, and the cold reality of her situation would wash over her. This wasn't just about Ben's future. It was about her present. It was about her right to live without fear, to exist on the money she had diligently earned over a lifetime. Her love for him was a mighty elemental force, but she realized with a dawning, painful clarity that her love for herself, or at least her fundamental right to self-preservation, had to count for something too. The decision solidified not in a moment of white-hot anger, but in a moment of profound, bone-deep sadness. She was standing by her window, watching the autumn leaves fall from the maple tree outside, a slow, inevitable shedding. She realized that the greatest, most difficult act of love she could offer her grandson was not to shield him from the consequences of his actions, but to force him, with all the power she could muster, to face them. It was a terrible, brutal form of love, but it was the only honest one she had left. With a heart that felt like a lead weight in her chest, she put on her coat and walked the 6 blocks to the local police precinct. The building was imposing and smelled of antiseptic, bureaucracy, and faint desperation. She sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, feeling small and invisible amongst the noise and activity. When her turn came, she was led to a small, cluttered cubicle where a uniformed officer named Miller sat, looking tired beyond his years. As she told her story, her voice was quiet and steady, a librarian's measured tone. She laid out the facts without emotion, speaking of dates, of amounts, of the footage on the security camera. She never once referred to Ben as my grandson. She called him by his full name, Benjamin Robert Vance, creating a necessary self-protective distance to survive the telling. Officer Miller typed, his expression neutral and professional. When she was finished, he looked up at her, a flicker of genuine sympathy in his tired eyes. "This is a tough situation, ma'am," he said softly. "Are you sure you want to press charges?" "I am," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, but she did not waver. "I am sure." The legal process was a slow, grinding, impersonal machine. Detectives came to her apartment to take a formal statement. She signed forms and affidavits. She gave them the password to her online bank account, the one Ben had helped her set up. Every step felt like a new betrayal, a violation of the familial sanctity she had once held so dear. Her daughter Sarah refused to speak to her, communicating only through furious, accusatory text messages that appeared on her phone like digital poison darts. Her books were not merely decorations arranged by color or size, they were companions, old friends arranged chronologically by the date she had first read them, each spine a marker on the timeline of her life. Her finances were managed with the same meticulous, almost reverent care. Ben was arrested, charged with grand larceny and identity theft, and released on bail. The court date was set for a cold day in January. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom felt vast and cold, all dark wood and high ceilings that seemed to swallow sound. Eleanor sat on a hard wooden bench, Frank a quiet, reassuring presence by her side. She saw Ben across the room, standing beside a harried-looking public defender, looking thin and pale in an ill-fitting suit she had never seen before. He wouldn't meet her eyes. When it was her turn to speak to the judge, she didn't read a vindictive victim impact statement. Her voice trembling only slightly, she spoke of her deep love for her grandson, of her immense pride in the young man he was supposed to become. And then she spoke of the deep, cavernous wound of his betrayal, not just for the money, which was devastating, but for the trust he had shattered. "I'm not here to ask for his punishment," she concluded, her eyes finally finding his across the wide, empty room. "I am here to ask for his recovery. I'm asking the court to give him the help, the structure, and the consequences that I can no longer provide." Perhaps her words had an effect. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had seen countless family dramas play out in this very room, seemed to listen intently, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly. Ben was spared jail time. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, mandatory weekly attendance at a Gamblers Anonymous program, and full financial restitution to be paid to Eleanor in monthly installments. It was justice, of a sort, but it felt like no victory at all. In the months that followed, a new, fragile rhythm began to establish itself. The Social Security Administration, prompted by the official police report, finally flagged her account for fraud and restored her direct deposit, this time with new, multi-factor security protocols that she diligently learned to use. The first restitution check from Ben arrived in the mail, a flimsy piece of paper inside a plain white envelope that represented so much more than its monetary value. It was a start. Her relationship with Sarah remained fractured, a desolate landscape of hurt and anger, but the absolute silence was occasionally broken by a hesitant, brief phone call, a tentative step toward a distant, unseen shore of forgiveness. Eleanor's own healing began not in solitude, but in community. Frank, seeing the deep well of her loneliness, encouraged her to attend a local support group for seniors who had been victims of financial fraud. In a circle of plastic chairs in a musty church basement, she told her story again. This time, she was met not with judgment or disbelief, but with quiet nods of understanding, with shared stories of manipulative caregivers, phantom prize scams, and family betrayals that mirrored her own in their painful intimacy. In their collective experience, she found a powerful antidote to her shame. She was not a fool. She was a victim. There was a profound difference. In a worn, leather-bound ledger, a relic from a time of ink and paper statements, she recorded every single expense, from a carton of 2% milk to her quarterly property tax payment. For a woman who had spent her career in the hushed, cathedral-like halls of the public library, predictability was not boring. It was peace. It was the quiet hum of a world working as it should. She began to volunteer, at first just making the weak coffee for the meetings, then later speaking to new members, her voice now confident and clear. She helped them navigate the same bureaucratic mazes she had once found so terrifying. She found a new purpose, not the one she had planned for her quiet retirement, but one that was forged in the crucible of her crisis. She was no longer just Eleanor Vance, retired librarian. She was a survivor, a guide, an advocate for the vulnerable. Her friendship with Frank deepened into a quiet, comfortable companionship, built on shared crosswords, afternoon walks, and the unspoken understanding of two people who knew what it was to face down the darker parts of life and keep going. One afternoon, a year after that first terrible discovery, she was helping a new group member, a frightened woman named Maria whose nephew had scammed her out of her savings, set up transaction alerts on her phone. "Every time $1 leaves your account, you'll get a text message," Eleanor explained calmly, her finger guiding Maria's. "You'll always know." As she looked at Maria's face, etched with fear and confusion, she saw her own terror from a year ago reflected back. But this time, she knew the way through the darkness. The third of the month no longer held any terror for her. The wound of Ben's betrayal would likely always be a scar, a tender place in her heart that would ache when the weather changed. But it was no longer an open, weeping wound. She had survived its poison. She had found a way to balance the ledger of her own life again, not with bitterness or revenge, but with resilience, purpose, and the quiet grace of a promise she made to herself, to never again be a victim. Her experience taught her hard-won lessons, principles she now shared with anyone who would listen, her librarian's voice imbued with a new, quiet authority. First, guard your information as you would your own front door. Never share your PINs or passwords, not even with those you love and trust the most. Affection should not be a key to your financial life. Second, become an active participant in your own security. Don't wait for paper statements that arrive weeks after a crime has been committed. Use online banking and mobile alerts to monitor your accounts weekly, if not daily. Knowledge is your first and best line of defense. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, never let shame silence you. The perpetrators of these crimes rely on their victims' fear of being judged as foolish or incompetent. If you suspect something is wrong, tell someone immediately, a trusted friend, a family member, the police. Seeking help is not a sign of weakness, it is your greatest strength. Social Security was the cornerstone of that peace. It was the monthly tangible assurance that she would never become a burden, a deep-seated fear that had haunted her waking moments since her husband Robert had passed away a decade prior, leaving a void in their home and in her heart that no amount of order could ever truly fill. She had worked. She had paid in, and the system, in turn, was meant to care for her. Her independence was not a luxury. It was her most prized possession, a fragile flame she guarded fiercely and managed with the precision of a ship's captain navigating treacherous waters. To be beholden to no one was the central tenet of her widowhood. Her grandson Ben was the one bright, gloriously unpredictable spark in her ordered existence. At 22, he was all lanky energy and charming, easy smiles, a whirlwind of youthful affection who would descend upon her quiet apartment, bearing lukewarm coffee in a paper cup, and breathless stories of his college classes and social triumphs. He was her daughter Sarah's boy, her only grandchild, and the undisputed luminous center of Eleanor's heart. He was a living, breathing connection to the future, a repository for all her hopes. "Grams, you've got to get with the times," he'd said a year ago, tapping his own smartphone with a dramatic flourish that made her smile. He had spent an entire afternoon sitting beside her on the floral sofa, the cushions sinking under his weight, his patience seemingly infinite as he guided her arthritic fingers through the bewildering maze of setting up online banking. He showed her how to check her balance, how to see pending transactions, how to transfer funds if she ever needed to. "See? Now you don't have to wait for the paper statement to see your deposit. You're in control," he'd beamed, and she'd felt a surge of genuine pride, not just in his kindness and technical wizardry, but in herself for learning this new trick, for not becoming one of those old women who were left behind by the relentless march of technology. This was the day her Social Security check, the bedrock of her independence, was deposited into her account. It wasn't a fortune, but it was hers. It was the roof over her head, the food in her pantry, the dignity she had earned from a lifetime of work as a librarian, stacking books and whispering order into chaos. She never thought of it as a gift from the government, but as a promise fulfilled. He'd helped her choose a password, something easy for her to remember. "How about Robert's birthday, Grams? You'll never forget that." He'd even written it down for her on a bright yellow sticky note, which she kept tucked securely inside the front cover of her ledger. "Just in case," he'd said with a conspiratorial wink. Ben was a constant, welcome presence, a warm sunbeam in her quiet life. He'd show up unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon just to change a high-up light bulb in her kitchen that she couldn't reach, his long arms making easy work of the task. He'd insist on carrying her groceries up the 2 flights of stairs to her apartment, even when she protested that she was perfectly capable. They had a standing ritual of watching old black-and-white movies on Sunday afternoons, sharing a bowl of stovetop popcorn on the couch while they debated the enduring merits of Humphrey Bogart versus Cary Grant. He was thoughtful in ways that belied his age, remembering not just her birthday, but her wedding anniversary, and most poignantly, the anniversary of Robert's passing. He would bring her a single white lily on that day each year, a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of her ongoing grief. In those moments, her love for him felt like a physical thing, a warmth that spread through her chest and eased the persistent low-grade ache of loneliness. He was, she often thought as she watched him leave, the very best part of her life. He was the future, a bright and promising continuation of her family line. He was good. He was kind. He was hers. This faith in him was as foundational as her faith in the monthly deposit. It was absolute, unquestionable. It was why on that disorienting October morning, her first reaction to the empty account was not suspicion, but simple, unadulterated confusion. A machine had made a mistake. A server in some distant air-conditioned room was down. The system had glitched. These were the logical, library-indexed explanations that her mind offered up first. This was a problem to be solved, an error to be corrected. She closed the app and reopened it, her finger tapping the small icon with deliberate care. Still zero. She took a deep breath and restarted her phone, watching the familiar logo appear and fade. She opened the app again. Still zero. A faint tremor of unease started in her stomach, a cold, coiling serpent of a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She decided to walk to the bank branch a few blocks away. The exercise and the crisp autumn air would surely clear her head and dispel this ridiculous digital phantom. The bank was an imposing building of granite and glass, designed to project an aura of impenetrable security. The teller, a young woman with a bored expression and expertly applied eyeliner, typed lethargically at her keyboard, her nails making sharp clicking sounds. "It shows the deposit was made on the 3rd at 1:15 a.m., the teller said, her eyes fixed on her screen. "Standard automated deposit," she paused. "And then a full withdrawal was made from an ATM at 1:22 a.m. Eleanor stared, the words failing to compute. They sounded like a foreign language. A withdrawal? But I was sleeping. I haven't used an ATM in months. The teller finally met her gaze, her eyes devoid of empathy or even curiosity. "Well, the system shows your card and PIN were used. Are you sure you didn't forget?" "Sometimes people do." The question was a small, sharp sting of condescension, a dismissal of her age and her faculties. A covenant. Then one crisp October morning, the covenant was broken. The promise vanished. She opened the banking app on her phone, a tool her grandson had so patiently installed for her, and stared at a number that made no sense: 0. The 3rd of the month had come and gone, but the money had not. "I am quite sure," Eleanor replied, her voice tight, a librarian's whisper that could nonetheless carry an edge of steel. She hadn't used her debit card in weeks. It sat in a dedicated, pristine slot in her wallet, reserved for true emergencies. It was an artifact, not a tool for daily use. You can file a dispute, but if the correct card and PIN were used, it's unlikely to be found as fraud, the teller recited, the words clearly part of a script she had repeated many times. She slid a multi-page form and a cheap ballpoint pen across the cold counter. The words, sterile, bureaucratic, final, were a dismissal. Eleanor took the form, her hands trembling so slightly it was almost imperceptible, and walked out of the bank into the now chilly afternoon. The solid ground of her well-ordered world was beginning to feel like quicksand. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Her apartment, usually a haven, felt strange and threatening. Every creak of the old building's floorboards, every groan of the ancient plumbing, sounded like an intruder. She lay awake for hours, staring at the shifting patterns of streetlight on her ceiling, replaying the teller's words. A withdrawal, an ATM, your card and PIN were used, in the dead of night. The sheer, maddening impossibility of it was a feedback loop in her brain. She must have been sleepwalking. Had she begun to lose her mind? Was this the beginning of a long, slow slide into dementia, a fear she pushed to the back of her mind but which always lingered? The fear was a cold, hard knot in her chest. Finally, unable to lie still, she got up and padded into the living room. She checked her wallet. The debit card was there, nestled in its usual place. She opened her ledger. The yellow sticky note with the password Ben had written was still tucked inside the front cover. Everything was in its proper place, yet everything was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. She spent the next few weeks in a state of anxious denial, surviving on the small emergency fund she kept in a vintage coffee can in her pantry, cash saved from years of pocketing loose change. It was her rainy day fund, and a storm had arrived. She ate canned soup that tasted of tin and salt and dry toast that scraped her throat, telling herself it was a temporary problem, a bureaucratic error that would soon be rectified by the faceless powers that be. Ben visited, his usual cheerful, sun-drenched self, and she couldn't bring herself to mention it. Voicing the problem felt like giving it power, making it real. Worse, it felt like asking for help, admitting she had lost control of her own life. The shame of it was a physical gag in her throat. He talked about the rising cost of his textbooks and a new problem with his car's alternator, and she nodded along, listening with a pained smile, the irony a bitter metallic taste in her mouth. She was rationing saltine crackers while he worried about a new alternator. The 3rd of November arrived with a sense of impending doom. She woke before dawn, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. With fingers that felt clumsy and foreign, she opened the banking app. For a fleeting, glorious, hopeful second, she saw it. The deposit. A positive balance. A wave of relief so profound it almost made her weep washed over her, a physical release of tension from every muscle in her body. The first time must have been a fluke, a one-time glitch now corrected, but her relief was brutally short-lived. She blinked, and as the app refreshed itself, the balance updated. A new transaction had appeared, time-stamped just minutes earlier, directly below the deposit. It was a digital ghost, a silent theft that left no trace but a hollow echo in her carefully ordered world. For 42 years, Eleanor Vance had built her life around a simple, unshakable rhythm. ATM withdrawal. The exact same amount, down to the penny. The money was gone. Again. This time, it wasn't confusion that hit her, it was terror. Cold, absolute, paralyzing terror. This was not a glitch. This was not an error. This was a predator. Someone was watching her account, waiting for that specific moment in the deep of night when her lifeline arrived, and then methodically, cruelly, stealing the very ground from beneath her feet. The 4 walls of her meticulously kept apartment, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance felt utterly, terrifyingly alone and unsafe. Desperation is a corrosive acid. It eats away at pride, at composure, at the carefully constructed walls of self-sufficiency that take a lifetime to build. For another week, Eleanor tried to solve the problem herself, to wrestle back control. She spent hours on the phone with the Social Security Administration, navigating a maddening labyrinth of automated menus. Press 1 for English. Press 3 for questions about your benefits. Please enter your 9-digit Social Security number followed by the pound key. Only to be placed on hold, the tinny, looping instrumental music, a mocking soundtrack to her mounting panic. When she finally reached a human, a weary-sounding man named David, he offered not solutions, but a litany of regulations. A report had to be filed. An investigation would be opened. It could take 90 days, maybe more. He spoke of fraud and identity theft in the calm, detached abstract, as if they were weather patterns, not a personal, intimate violation that left her staring at an empty refrigerator. "But I need that money now," she pleaded, her voice cracking, the carefully controlled librarian's tone finally breaking. "That's what I live on. I have bills to pay. I need to buy food." "I understand, ma'am," David said, his tone suggesting he understood nothing at all, merely that he was required to say he did. "You'll be notified by mail of the outcome of the investigation." The click of the disconnected line was one of the loneliest, most final sounds she had ever heard. Her carefully balanced ledger was now a mockery, its neat columns filled with numbers that no longer added up to security, only to a growing, terrifying deficit. The coffee can of emergency cash was nearly empty, a few crumpled bills, and a handful of coins remaining. She began making impossible, soul-crushing choices. Heat or vegetables? Her heart medication or the electricity bill? Every decision was a surrender, a small piece of her dignity chipped away. She started avoiding the small talk with neighbors in the hallway, convinced they could see her failure, that her poverty was a scent she carried with her, like mothballs and despair. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious, labored effort. It was during one of these furtive trips to the mailbox, her head bowed as if against a strong wind, that she nearly collided with Frank Petrocelli from apartment 3B. Frank was a fixture in the building, a retired police detective with a brusque demeanor, a noticeable limp from an old-on-the-job injury, and eyes that missed nothing. He was a man of strict routine, a walk to the newsstand at 8 a.m. for the paper, a crossword puzzle in the lobby at 3 p.m. He wasn't unkind, but he kept to himself, wrapped in an aura of seen-it-all cynicism. It was a life measured in the turning of pages from the Dewey Decimal System, the careful unfurling of her window box geraniums from tight green buds to riotous pink blossoms, and the quiet, profound satisfaction of a budget balanced to the very last penny. Her world was a sanctuary of order, a small fortress against the chaos she had spent her career cataloging. He steadied her with a surprisingly gentle hand on her arm, and his sharp assessing gaze took in her pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the tremor in her hands as she clutched a handful of junk mail. "Whoa there, Eleanor. You look like you've seen a ghost." Something inside her, worn down by weeks of fear and shame and gnawing hunger, finally broke. The story tumbled out, a torrent of confused, frightened words about deposits and withdrawals, about the bored teller and the hold music, and the cold, relentless terror of the vanishing money. She spoke in the hushed, urgent tone of someone confessing a terrible, shameful secret. Frank listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable, his gaze steady. When she finished, her voice trailing off into a ragged, helpless whisper, he didn't offer the empty platitudes or easy reassurances she had been expecting. He simply nodded, a short, decisive dip of his chin. "Meet me in the lobby in 10 minutes, he said, his voice a low rumble of authority she hadn't heard in years. "We're going to the bank. And this time, you're not going alone." Walking into the bank with Frank was a completely different experience. Where she had been hesitant, apologetic, and easily dismissed, Frank was a solid, immovable object. He walked with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had spent 30 years navigating bureaucracy and confronting liars. He didn't ask to speak to a teller. He walked directly to the service desk and asked for the branch manager by name. They were ushered into a small glass office belonging to a man named Mer Henderson, who had a tidy desk, a bland corporate painting on the wall, and a practiced professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor started to retell her story, her voice wavering, but Frank held up a hand, stopping her gently. "She's been here before, Henderson," Frank said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "She's been victimized by a crime twice, using your bank's ATM. We're not here to file another useless dispute form that will end up in a circular file. We're here for information. I want the exact date, time, and most importantly, the physical location of the ATM used for both withdrawals. And I want to see the security footage from that machine for both of those times. Today." Mr. Henderson's professional smile tightened at the edges. "Sir, I can't just release security footage. There are privacy protocols, corporate policies. I'd have to go through legal." "Is Eleanor Vance's financial security part of your corporate policy?" Frank countered, leaning forward slightly, his presence seeming to suck the air out of the small office. "Or do you only care about privacy when it's protecting a thief? Let's be clear. 2 identical thefts happening moments after a federal deposit. This isn't a random mugging. This is targeted. It's a pattern, and it's happening on your watch, with your machines. Now, you can help us, or I can spend my afternoon filing a formal complaint with the State Banking Commission and then making some calls to a few friends of mine at the local news desk. I'm thinking of a headline. Local bank ignores pleas of elderly victim as thief empties her Social Security account twice. I'm retired. I've got all the time in the world." The bluff, if it was one, was masterful. Mr. Henderson's composure cracked. He cleared his throat, his gaze shifting from Frank's stony, unblinking face to Eleanor's pleading one. He sighed, a long, weary sound of complete defeat. "Let me see what I can do. Pulling the footage from the off-site servers can take a day or two." At the heart of this rhythm, at the very core of her well-regulated existence, was a date of almost sacred importance, the 3rd of every month. This was the day her Social Security check, the bedrock of her hard-won independence, was deposited silently, faithfully into her modest checking account. It wasn't a fortune, not by any stretch of the imagination, but its value was immeasurable. "We'll be back tomorrow at noon," Frank said, standing up, the meeting clearly over. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Henderson." They walked out into the bright sunlight, and Eleanor felt the first fragile flicker of hope she had felt in weeks. It wasn't just that Frank had taken charge, it was that he had believed her without question. He had validated her fear, had taken her terror seriously. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet awe. Frank gave a wry, humorless smile. "People in charge are paid to follow a script. They're afraid of anything that isn't in the script. You just have to convince them that not following their rules is the easier, less painful option." As they waited for the bank's call, life fell into a strange suspended pattern. The world was divided into two distinct parts: the gnawing, ever-present anxiety about her stolen money and the distracting, comforting, and now profoundly painful presence of her grandson. Ben's visits continued, a surreal counterpoint to the grim drama unfolding behind the scenes. He arrived one afternoon with a bag of her favorite lemon cookies from the bakery down the street and an air of manufactured cheerfulness. "Just thought I'd check in on my favorite Graham," he said, kissing her on the cheek. His skin was cool. His familiar scent of laundry detergent and mint filled her senses. The casual, unthinking affection was like a knife twisting in her gut. A new, ugly thought had begun to take root in the dark, unlit corners of her mind, a venomous weed she tried desperately to pull out before it could grow. Who knew her routine? Who knew exactly when her money arrived? Who had helped her set up that app, had helped her choose a password based on her dead husband's birthday? The thought was a sibilant whisper in the back of her consciousness. Ben. She felt a wave of visceral self-loathing for even considering it. This was her boy. Her sweet, loving Ben. This was paranoia. The fear was making her crazy, turning her against the one person she loved most in the world. She forced a smile, pushing the treacherous thought away with all her might. "My laptop's been acting up again," she said, seizing on a neutral, safe topic. "It's so slow I can barely check my email." "No problem, Grams," he said, his face lighting up with genuine purpose. "Let me take a look." He sat at her small kitchen table, the laptop open, his long, graceful fingers flying across the keyboard. He clicked and typed with an effortless speed that amazed her, murmuring about clearing caches and deleting temporary files. Eleanor watched him, a silent war raging within her. She saw the capable, helpful young man, so patient and tech-savvy. But behind him, she now saw a shadow, a person who had complained about money problems, someone with intimate, detailed knowledge of her financial life. He was there for nearly an hour, and when he was done, the laptop was indeed running much faster. "All fixed," he announced proudly. "You just have to know what you're doing." She thanked him, her heart a leaden, painful weight in her chest. As he hugged her goodbye at the door, his arms wrapping around her in a familiar embrace, she had to fight the primal urge to recoil. The call from Mr. Henderson came the next day, precisely at 11 o'clock. "The footage is ready for you to view," he said, his voice clipped and formal, offering no apology. Frank knocked on her door a few minutes later, his face grimly determined. "Ready?" he asked. She wasn't, not in the slightest, but she nodded anyway. There was no turning back now. The viewing room at the bank was a small, windowless office that smelled of stale air and industrial carpet cleaner. It was hers. It was the roof over her head, a cozy two-room apartment that still held the faint, sweet scent of her late husband's pipe tobacco, if she closed her eyes and concentrated. It was the wholesome food in her pantry, oats and tins of soup and a single jar of expensive marmalade she allowed herself as a treat. It was the kind of anonymous, soulless room where bad news was delivered. Mr. Henderson sat them in front of a large monitor, his demeanor cold and distant, as if he were merely performing a distasteful but necessary task. "I'll play the footage from the 3rd of last month first," he said, clicking his mouse. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, high-contrast black and white image of the bank's drive-through aid. The timestamp in the corner read 1:19 a.m. The street was deserted, washed in the eerie, unnatural orange glow of the streetlights. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure walked into the frame from the right. The person was bundled in a dark, hooded sweatshirt, the hood pulled low, their face entirely obscured by shadow. Eleanor held her breath, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. The figure moved with a youthful, fluid gait that was impossible to identify. They inserted a card, typed on the keypad with quick, sure movements, and waited. A fan of cash spooled out of the machine. The figure quickly pocketed it and walked away, melting back into the darkness from which they came. It was impossible to see a face. "It could be anyone," Eleanor whispered, a frantic, desperate relief washing over her. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. She had been foolish and paranoid. "Let's see the second one," Frank said, his voice tight, his eyes narrowed on the screen. "Mr." Henderson clicked the mouse again. The screen changed to footage from the 3rd of the current month. Same ATM, same ungodly time of night. The same hooded figure walked into the frame. The same sequence of events played out with chilling, practiced efficiency. But this time, as the figure turned to leave, they glanced back toward the street, perhaps startled by the distant sound of a car. For a fraction of a second, the camera caught their profile. And in that moment, the hood shifted. The sharp angle of the jaw, the curve of the nose, the way a few dark curls escaped at the nape of the neck. It was horribly, sickeningly familiar. It was Ben. Eleanor made a small, choking sound, a noise of strangled denial. "No," she breathed. "No, the quality is so poor. It's blurry. It could be a trick of the light." "Wait," Frank said, his voice sharp, his eyes locked on the screen. He pointed a thick finger. "Henderson, can you zoom in right there?" On his jacket sleeve, Mr. Henderson manipulated the mouse. The image magnified, pixelating slightly but still clear enough. On the left sleeve of the dark sweatshirt was a small circular logo, the distinctive roaring tiger emblem of a local university's athletic department. Eleanor's blood ran cold, a freezing tide that rose from her feet to her throat. She knew that logo. She knew that jacket. She had bought it for him herself, for his 22nd birthday just 2 months ago. She remembered the feel of the soft fleece under her fingers in the university bookstore, the proud look on his face when he'd tried it on. She remembered tucking the receipt into her purse, feeling the quiet, simple joy of giving a perfect gift to the person she loved most. The memory collided with the grainy, monstrous image on the screen, and the world fractured. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. The small, sterile room began to spin. The man on the screen was not a faceless predator, not a stranger in the night. He was the boy she had taught to read, the boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged with cartoon character plasters, the boy who brought her lemon cookies and watched old movies with her on the floral sofa. It was the dignity she had earned from a lifetime of diligent work as a librarian, stacking books, mending broken spines, and whispering order into the sprawling, beautiful chaos of human knowledge. She never thought of it as a gift from the government, some charitable handout. To Eleanor, it was a promise fulfilled. A covenant forged between her decades of labor and the society she had served. He was the keeper of her stories and the center of her heart. And he had been stealing her life month by month in the dead of night while she slept just a few miles away. Frank placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but she didn't feel it. She was falling, endlessly, into a place darker and colder than she had ever imagined possible. The walk home from the bank was a silent, surreal journey through a city whose colors seemed to have been bled away, leaving only shades of gray. Frank walked beside her, his quiet, solid presence a barrier against the chaos Cersei was swirling in her mind. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, allowing her the dignity of her profound shock. When they reached her apartment door, he simply squeezed her arm gently and said, "I'm in 3B if you need anything." "Anything at all, Eleanor." She nodded, unable to form words, and retreated into the sanctuary that now felt like a crime scene, tainted by a violation more intimate than any broken lock or shattered window. Her apartment, once a source of comfort and order, was now filled with ghosts. Every object was a monument to her love for Ben, and every memory was now poisoned by the truth. There on the mantelpiece was the framed photo of a smiling, gap-toothed 7-year-old Ben at his pirate-themed birthday party. There on the counter was the slightly lopsided clay mug he'd made her in a high school pottery class, which she still used for her morning tea despite the crooked handle. There was the heavy wool afghan draped over the armchair, the one he'd curl up under during their movie Sundays, complaining of the draft. She moved through the rooms like a wraith, touching these artifacts of a life she no longer recognized. The betrayal was not a clean wound. It was a systemic infection, spreading backward through time, rewriting every cherished moment into a chapter of a long, elaborate, cruel deception. Sleep was impossible. When she closed her eyes, she saw the hooded figure at the ATM, the flash of the familiar jacket. She saw his smile, not as the warm, genuine expression she had always loved, but as a grotesque mask hiding a stranger. How could she have been so blind? The signs, in retrospect, were all there, laid out like clues she had refused to see. His constant, vague complaints about being broke, his unusual interest in her finances, his insistence on setting up her online banking, giving him the keys to her kingdom. She had seen it all not as red flags, but as signs of his affection and concern. Her love had been a blindfold, one she had tied willingly and securely around her own eyes. 2 days passed in a thick fog of grief and disbelief. She didn't eat. She didn't answer the phone when it rang. She sat in the armchair, the unwatched television flickering, and debated the impossible, paralyzing question. What now? Part of her, the grandmotherly part that was etched into her very DNA, wanted to erase the footage from her mind, to pretend it never happened, to lock the truth away in a dark room and go on loving the grandson she thought she knew. But the truth had sharp edges. It was a physical presence in the room with her. Her money was gone. Her security was shattered. If she did nothing, it would happen again on the 3rd of next month and the month after that. He wouldn't stop. Why would he? On the 3rd day, a knock came at the door, cheerful and familiar. It was Ben, right on schedule, holding a small white paper bag. "Hey, Grams, I brought donuts." Then, one crisp October morning, as the autumn sun cast long, slanted shadows across her living room floor, the covenant was broken. The promise vanished into the cold, indifferent ether of the digital world, the kind with the sprinkles you like. His smile was bright, his eyes clear. There was no hint of guilt, no shadow of his secret nocturnal life. Seeing him standing there, so normal, so utterly oblivious to the fact that she knew, sent a wave of icy, unnatural calm through her. The time for grieving her idealized version of him was over. It was time to face the person, the stranger, standing in front of her. "Come in, Ben," she said, her voice unnervingly steady. "We need to talk." She didn't lead him to the comfortable sofa in the living room, their usual spot. She led him to the hard-backed chairs at the small, polished kitchen table. She sat opposite him, her hands folded primly on the wood surface. She let the silence stretch, watching as his cheerful demeanor slowly faltered under her unwavering, solemn gaze. "Is everything okay, Grams?" he asked, his voice losing its easy confidence. "I went to the bank, Ben," she began, her voice low and even, each word carefully chosen and placed. "I went with my neighbor, Frank. He's a retired detective, and they've been looking into why my Social Security money has been disappearing for the last 2 months. She saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He was preparing a defense, constructing a lie. Oh, wow. Did they find anything? Some kind of bank error? He was acting, playing the part of the concerned grandson, and the performance was chillingly convincing. "They found something," she continued, her heart feeling like a cold stone in her chest. "They found the ATM where the withdrawals were made. They have security footage." She held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. "They showed it to us, Ben. The footage. From last month and the month before." Ben's face went pale, the color draining away until his skin was the color of parchment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at her, his expression a chaotic mixture of raw terror and disbelief. "It was you, Ben," she said, the words falling like shards of glass into the silent room. "At the ATM in the middle of the night. You were wearing the jacket I bought you for your birthday. He broke. The carefully constructed facade of the charming, loving grandson crumbled into dust. He slumped forward, burying his head in his hands, and a terrible, ragged sob tore from his throat. It was not the sound of a calculating thief, but of a desperate, frightened child. The denials she had braced herself for, the arguments she had prepared to counter, never came. There was only the awful, gut-wrenching sound of his weeping in her quiet kitchen. Slowly, painfully, the whole sordid, pathetic story emerged between his gasps and choked apologies. It had started with online sports betting, he explained, just for fun, just a few dollars with friends. But it had spiraled out of control with terrifying speed. He'd lost more than he had. He'd borrowed from a friend to cover it, then lost that too. Soon he was in deep debt to a shady online loan agency that charged criminal interest rates. They were threatening him, he said, his voice muffled by his hands. They were threatening to go to his parents, to get him kicked out of college. He was trapped, scared, and saw her Social Security deposit, a sum he knew arrived like clockwork, as an easy, temporary solution. He'd only meant to borrow it, he sobbed, to pay it back as soon as he could. But he never could. He just dug the hole deeper each month. I was going to pay you back, Grams, I swear, he cried, finally looking up at her, his young face streaked with tears and shame.